People keep saying language is evolving. That sounds innocent enough. It sounds civilized. It sounds like the kind of phrase a person would use right before they hide something ugly in a cleaner box. But a lot of what gets called evolution is really just avoidance. We do not always change words because the old ones are inaccurate. Sometimes we change them because the old ones are honest. And honesty has a way of standing there with no makeup on. It makes people uncomfortable. It makes them face the thing they have been training themselves not to see. So they soften it, they blur it, they decorate it. They wrap it in enough polite language to keep the truth from touching the skin too directly. A fire is no longer a fire. It is an incident. A death is no longer a death. It is a passing. A lie is no longer a lie. It is a misstatement, a distortion, an alternative framing, a communication error, a misunderstanding, anything but the thing itself. And once a society becomes skilled at this, it begins to lose its grip on reality one polished syllable at a time, because language does not just describe the world, it trains the mind. It tells people what is safe to feel, what is acceptable to admit, and what must be buried under softer words so nobody has to stand too close to the ugliness of what is actually happening. The first place this sickness shows up is in institutions that are supposed to tell the truth. Politics does it, corporations do it, schools do it, medicine does it. The media does it so often that people barely notice anymore. A failure becomes a setback. A collapse becomes a restructuring. Getting rid of workers becomes optimizing headcount. Cutting costs becomes streamlining operations. People are not fired anymore. They are released, transitioned, right-sized, redeployed, made redundant, or separated from the organization. Separated from the organization. That is the kind of phrase a person invents when they want you to forget that a human being just lost their income, their stability, and maybe their sleep for the next 6 months. War gets the same treatment. Collateral damage, neutralization, surgical strike, peacekeeping, stabilization, operation, intervention. It always sounds more noble when nobody in the room has to smell the blood. And this is not an accident. The softer the word, the easier the conscience. The cleaner the phrase, the easier the lie. Because if you can rename the damage, you can reduce the guilt. If you can rename the victim, you can reduce the shame. If you can rename the act, you can make it feel less human. That is why bureaucratic language is so dangerous. It does not merely hide reality, it trains people to stop reacting to it. It creates emotional insulation. It makes cruelty sound procedural. It gives cowardice a professional tone. It allows institutions to keep doing terrible things while sounding calm, measured, and responsible. And the public loves it because the public is tired. People are exhausted from confronting reality. Reality is expensive. Reality asks for judgment. Reality demands that you say what something is, not what it sounds like after a committee has cleaned it up. People would rather hear that a loved one passed than died, because death is a hard word, and hard words hit like weather. They would rather say someone is plus-sized, differently abled, senior, economically disadvantaged, or underperforming, because each of those phrases lets them step around the raw edge of what is in front of them. Not all of that is evil by itself. Some of it begins as kindness. Some of it begins as restraint. But the problem is that every soft word creates the possibility of one more soft lie, and one lie creates the need for another. Eventually, people are not protecting each other from cruelty. They're protecting each other from clarity. They are building a society where nobody says what they mean, nobody means what they say, and everybody pretends that this is progress, because the language feels gentler. But gentleness is not the same thing as truth, and truth is not the same thing as brutality. A word can be sharp without being cruel. A sentence can be direct without being hateful. What we have lost is not politeness. We have lost precision. We have lost the courage to name things before they rot into abstraction. Once you remove the honest word, the thing itself gets harder to recognize. And once reality becomes harder to recognize, manipulation becomes easier. That is the real cost. Not embarrassment, not awkwardness, control. So the final trick is this. Euphemism does not just protect feelings, it protects power. The more complicated the language becomes, the fewer people can challenge it. The more sterile the vocabulary, the easier it is to hide damage inside it. People People stop noticing the violence because the sentence sounds respectable. They stop noticing the corruption because the title sounds official. They stop noticing the suffering because the label sounds compassionate. That is how reality gets managed, not always with censorship, sometimes with replacement, sometimes with a nicer word standing exactly where the honest one used to stand. And when that happens enough times, people stop trusting their own instincts. They hear a soft phrase and assume the world behind it must also be soft. It is not. The world is still hard. It is still brutal. It is still full of hunger, fear, greed, death, exploitation, and loss. The only difference is that now we have built a language system that lets us look away while pretending we are being civilized. That is why the truth matters so much. Not because it is pretty, not because it is comfortable, because without it, everything becomes easier to sell and harder to resist. And once a society becomes fluent in hiding the real word, it starts hiding the real wound, too. At that point, the language is no longer serving reality. Reality is serving the language. And that is how people end up living inside a lie that sounds polite, sounds educated, sounds modern, and still leaves them completely lost. And the most disturbing part is that people begin to prefer the euphemism over the truth, because the euphemism asks less of them. Truth demands a reaction. Truth demands a judgment. Truth demands that you accept the shape of what is happening without sanding down the edges until it feels safe to hold. Euphemism is easier. It lets people remain emotionally unbothered while still believing they are decent. It allows them to speak about destruction as if it were administration, about abandonment as if it were transition, about humiliation as if it were feedback, and about collapse as if it were change. That is why modern language feels so full of air. So many words now are designed to hover above the actual event instead of landing inside it. They sound refined, but they do not touch anything. They glide over pain, skirt responsibility, and soften guilt just enough to keep the machine running. A person can hear one of these phrases and feel informed without ever being forced to imagine the human cost underneath it. That is the real genius of euphemism. It does not merely hide ugly reality, it makes the hiding look intelligent. It makes avoidance sound compassionate. It makes cowardice seem mature. And once that happens, the entire culture starts drifting away from direct experience and into managed perception, where the word becomes more acceptable than the wound, and the performance of sensitivity becomes more important than the facts themselves. There is also a deeper reason euphemisms spread so easily. They protect people from moral responsibility. When the language gets soft enough, the conscience gets sleepy. You can say someone was misled instead of manipulated, terminated instead of discarded, passed on instead of died, enhanced interrogation instead of torture, and suddenly the emotional weight of the event drops away, not because the event became smaller, but because the word did. That is the fraud. The word gets smaller, and the mind follows it. The sentence becomes a kind of sedative. It calms the crowd just enough to prevent outrage, and it calms the speaker just enough to avoid shame. This is why so many people in power love abstract language. It lets them commit concrete harm without sounding like the kind of person who would ever do such a thing. And once that pattern becomes normal, ordinary people start imitating it in their own lives. They talk around the truth with the same polished distance. They avoid plain speech because plain speech might expose them, might force them to admit they were wrong, might force them to name what they tolerated, what they ignored, what they enabled. So the language keeps thinning out, and with it, the courage to speak plainly. In the end, a culture that cannot say what is happening will eventually lose the ability to understand what is happening at all.